Harold Bennett stood at the head of a boardroom table in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and he said the word retirement out loud for the first time in his life, believing, with everything in him, that he was finally stepping into the future he had spent 2 years imagining beside his wife. He did not know that 14 months earlier, in a lawyer's office across town, leased Bennett had already signed the first documents that would end their marriage. He did not know that while he rehearsed his retirement speech in front of a bathroom mirror, his wife was quietly meeting with an attorney who specialized in exactly one thing: making sure a wealthy man's spouse walked away with everything she was owed before he had the chance to protect it. He believed he was announcing a beginning. In reality, he was the last person in his own life to find out the ending had already been written. There is a particular kind of blindness that comes with trusting someone completely, and Harold Bennett had spent 62 years building an empire without ever once considering that the person closest to him might be the one he needed to watch most carefully. He built his company from a single leased warehouse into one of the largest privately owned manufacturing operations on the East Coast. He negotiated with steel executives who tried to undercut him and won. He survived 2 recessions that bankrupted men he considered smarter than himself. And yet the one negotiation happening inside his own house, the one that would determine what he walked away with after 30 years of marriage, was the one negotiation he never saw coming, because he never imagined he needed to defend himself against the person sleeping beside him every night. Before we go any further into how this unraveled, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What makes this story difficult to sit with is not simply that leased Bennett planned to leave her husband. People leave marriages every day, and there is no shame in wanting a different life. What makes this story difficult is the timeline, the careful and deliberate sequence of events that shows a woman who understood, with more precision than her husband's own financial advisors, exactly what a retirement restructuring would do to the assets she stood to claim, and who made her move while he still believed they were building a shared future together. She did not leave in anger. She did not leave after a single betrayal she could point to and say, "This is where it ended." She left according to a calendar only she could see, timed to a moment in his life when he was at his most trusting and his least suspicious. Harold's son from his first marriage, a guarded and watchful man named Grant, had his own suspicions long before his father ever did, though even Grant did not understand the full shape of what was happening until it was almost too late to stop it. Grant had spent 2 years quietly tracking financial statements he was never supposed to see, certain that something in his father's second marriage did not add up, certain that a woman 11 years younger than his father had not simply fallen in love with a warehouse owner turned industrialist for the warmth of his personality alone. He was right to be suspicious. He was simply looking in the wrong direction, expecting a scandal, an affair, a single dramatic moment of exposure, when what was actually happening was slower, quieter, and in its own way, far more calculated than anything he had imagined. And there was one more person in that house who understood more than anyone gave her credit for. A woman who had worked for the Bennett family for nearly 2 decades, who had watched Harold's first wife decline slowly before her passing, who had watched leased arrive and settle into the house with a warmth that felt, to everyone around her, completely genuine. This woman kept her own quiet record of small details nobody else thought to notice. Phone calls taken only in the garden, mail that arrived at an address nobody in the family recognized. A stack of small observations that meant nothing on their own, but together told a story that would eventually change everything for a man who believed, right up until the moment the truth was placed directly in front of him, that his marriage and his retirement were both moving toward the exact same future. By the time you finish this story, you will understand exactly how a man who spent his entire life reading people correctly in business missed the one deception happening at his own kitchen table. And you will understand why the truth, when it finally came, did not come from his wife, and it did not come from his son, but from the one person in that house nobody thought to watch closely enough. Stay with me, because what happened next changed the way this family understood loyalty, timing, and exactly how long someone can smile at you while already planning to walk away. To understand how a man this careful in business could be caught so completely off guard at home, you have to go back nearly 40 years, to a much younger Harold Bennett standing in a leased warehouse with a single delivery truck and a stack of invoices he did not yet know how he would pay. He had grown up the son of a factory foreman, watching his father clock in and out of the same building for 30 years without ever once being asked his opinion about how the place should run. Harold promised himself, somewhere in his early 20s, that he would never spend his life waiting for someone else's permission to build something of his own. He started small, buying fabric remnants other manufacturers considered waste and selling them to local seamstresses who could not afford full bolts. It was not glamorous work. It did not pay well in the beginning, but it was his, and that mattered to him more than almost anything else in those years. Carol was there from the very start, a young schoolteacher who had married Harold when he still had more debt than assets, and who believed in the business long before there was any real evidence to justify that belief. She kept the books in the evenings after her own workday ended. She answered the phone when Harold was out making deliveries, and she learned to speak about fabric weights and thread counts with a confidence that surprised the buyers who assumed a schoolteacher would know nothing about the trade. Together, over almost 2 decades, they built Bennett Home and Textile into something real, something that eventually employed hundreds of people across 3 states, something that Harold, by his own later admission, could never have built without a partner who believed in him before belief was justified by results. When Carol was diagnosed, Harold was 58 years old and at the height of his professional success, and he later said that the diagnosis was the first time in his adult life that money had felt completely useless to him. He hired the best specialists. He flew in consultants from other states. None of it changed the outcome, and over the course of nearly 2 years, he watched the woman who had built this life alongside him slowly lose the strength to be part of it. Marjorie Doyle, already working in the household by then, later told a close friend that watching Harold during those 2 years was like watching a man learn, in real time, that all his careful planning could not protect him from the one thing he wanted most to control. Carol passed on a quiet Tuesday morning in early spring, with Harold and a very young, deeply grieving Grant at her bedside. In the weeks that followed, Harold did something almost no one who knew him expected. He stepped back from daily operations at the company for nearly 4 months, the longest period in 3 decades that he had not personally reviewed every major decision the business made. He told his executive team he needed time. What he did not say, because he barely understood it himself in those months, was that he needed time to figure out who he was without the one person who had watched him become who he was. He did not date again for almost 3 years, and when he finally did, it was tentative, careful, almost apologetic, as though he felt he needed permission from a version of himself that no longer fully existed. Friends introduced him to a handful of women during that period, women who were, by every account, kind and genuinely interested in him. But Harold found himself comparing each of them, unfairly and involuntarily, to a version of partnership that had taken 2 decades to build with Carol. He began to believe, quietly, that he might simply spend the rest of his life running the company alone, coming home to a large, well-kept, and mostly silent house. That was the exact state Harold Bennett was in when he walked into a charity dinner honoring a hospital wing his company had helped fund. 61 years old, still sharp in every boardroom he entered, and completely unguarded in the one part of his life that had nothing to do with business. It is worth pausing here to say plainly what almost no one around Harold said to him directly at the time, that a person recovering from a profound loss, however capable they remain professionally, often becomes the easiest person in the room to read, and the easiest person to approach with exactly the right amount of warmth at exactly the right moment. Eleanor Bennett was 49 that night, and by every account from people who witnessed the two of them meet, she was extraordinarily good at making Harold feel like the most interesting person in the room. She asked him about the early years of the business, about the leased warehouse and the delivery truck, in a way that felt like genuine fascination rather than polite conversation. She laughed at the right moments. She remembered small details from earlier in their conversation and brought them back up later in the evening, a technique that, whether calculated or instinctive, made Harold feel deeply and immediately understood in a way he had not felt in years. What almost nobody at that dinner knew, including Harold, was that Alina had spent the better part of the previous 15 years moving through social circles adjacent to genuine wealth without ever fully belonging to them herself. She had been married once before, briefly, in her 30s, to a man of moderate means whose business had ultimately failed, and the divorce that followed had left her with far less financial security than she had expected walking into that marriage. Friends of Alina, from that period later, described her, carefully and without malice, as someone who had learned a difficult lesson early, that charm alone did not guarantee security, and that security required planning, patience, and an understanding of exactly how financial structures actually worked, not just how romantic they appeared. That first marriage, to a small business owner named Vincent Halloway, had begun with genuine affection on both sides, according to people who knew them at the time, and it unraveled slowly over nearly 6 years as Vincent's business struggled through a difficult economic stretch that eventually forced its closure. Alina watched, during those years, as decisions she had no direct control over steadily eroded a financial security she had assumed was permanent, and she later described the experience, in a rare unguarded conversation with a close friend, as the moment she understood that being a good and supportive spouse offered no protection whatsoever if the underlying financial structure of a marriage was poorly built or poorly understood. When the marriage ended, Alina received a settlement considerably smaller than she needed to rebuild the life she had imagined, and she spent the following several years working a series of positions in event planning and charitable fundraising, work that placed her, repeatedly and by design, in close proximity to wealthy donors and their families without ever placing her fully inside that world herself. It was during this period that Alina first began to develop the careful, patient approach to relationships and financial planning that would later define her marriage to Harold, though nothing about this evolution happened as a single deliberate decision. It accumulated gradually, conversation by conversation, disappointment by disappointment, until by the time she met Harold at that charity dinner, she had already spent over a decade refining an understanding of exactly what questions to ask, what documents mattered, and how to build financial security into a relationship without ever appearing to prioritize it over genuine affection. Whether this made her calculating or simply cautious, shaped by a painful earlier experience most people would recognize as reasonable to learn from, is a question the people closest to this story continued to disagree about long after the settlement was finalized. Within 8 months of meeting at that charity dinner, Harold and Alina were engaged, a timeline that struck several people close to Harold, including his longtime attorney Nathaniel Cross, as fast for a man who had spent 3 years being famously cautious about dating at all. Nathaniel gently raised the idea of a prenuptial agreement, not out of any specific suspicion of Alina, but simply as standard practice for a man of Harold's net worth entering a second marriage with adult children from his first. Alina signed the agreement without visible hesitation, and Harold, watching her sign it so readily, took it as further proof that her feelings for him were exactly what they appeared to be, uncomplicated by his wealth, genuine in a way that made him believe, for the first time in years, that he had found real partnership again. What Harold did not understand in that moment, and would not fully understand for close to a decade, is that a prenuptial agreement only protects a person from what it specifically anticipates, and that a patient and observant spouse has years to learn exactly what falls outside those protections. Alina spent much of the next several years doing precisely that, not through any single dramatic act of research, but through the accumulation of small, ordinary conversations, casual questions about how the company was structured, curious remarks about which assets were held personally versus through the business, gentle interest in Harold's estate planning that read, to everyone around her. As the natural curiosity of a devoted wife, rather than the patient information gathering of someone building a long-term plan. Grant Bennett was 36 years old when his father remarried, still raw in his own way from watching his mother's decline and death, and he did not take the engagement announcement well, though he would not have described his reaction in those terms at the time. He told his father directly that the relationship felt rushed. He told close friends, more privately and more bluntly, that he did not trust a woman who had entered his father's life at the exact moment Harold was most vulnerable and most eager to believe that a second chance at partnership was possible. Grant's suspicion, in those early years, did not come from any specific piece of evidence. It came from an instinct he could not fully articulate, and which he mostly kept to himself out of respect for his father's obvious happiness. That instinct hardened into something more concrete during the third year of Harold and Alina's marriage, when Grant, attending a family dinner, overheard Alina asking his father a series of detailed questions about how the company's ownership structure would change if Harold ever stepped back from daily operations. On its own, the conversation was unremarkable, the kind of question any engaged spouse might ask. But Grant noticed, and later admitted he could not entirely explain why he noticed, that Alina asked the same underlying question in several different ways over the course of the evening, circling the topic from multiple angles in a manner that felt, to him, less like curiosity and more like careful information gathering. He said nothing that night, but it was the first moment he began, quietly and without telling anyone, to pay closer attention. Over the following 2 years, Grant's private suspicion expanded into something closer to an informal investigation, though he would have resisted that word himself at the time. He began keeping his own loose mental record of moments that felt slightly off. A comment Alina made about a business associate's recent divorce settlement, an unusually specific question about how a family trust his father had established years earlier actually worked, a pattern of increased travel to visit an aging relative that never quite lined up, in small ways, with details Alina mentioned about the trip afterward. None of it, individually, amounted to proof of anything. Grant knew this, and it frustrated him, because he could not bring vague unease to his father as though it were evidence, especially not against a marriage that made Harold, by every visible measure, genuinely happy. It is worth pausing here to address something the story could easily get wrong if we are not careful, because, for a period of nearly 8 months during this stretch, Grant's suspicion actually attached itself to the wrong target entirely, and understanding that mistake matters for understanding how long the real truth stayed hidden. A junior executive at Bennett Home and Textile named Douglas Farrow had, around this same period, become unusually close to Alina through a series of charity events the company sponsored, and Grant, noticing the frequency of their interactions, began to suspect that Alina was involved in an affair with Farrow, one that might eventually surface publicly and force his father to confront the marriage's problems directly. Grant spent nearly 8 months quietly monitoring this relationship, growing increasingly convinced he was closing in on the real story, only to eventually learn, almost by accident, that Farrow was in fact working with Alina on a legitimate charitable initiative unrelated to anything Grant had imagined, and that whatever closeness existed between them was entirely professional. I want you to hold on to that detail, because it tells you something important about how these situations actually unfold outside of the dramatic version most people imagine when they hear the word betrayal. Grant spent 8 months chasing a scandal that did not exist, while the actual threat to his father's fortune continued moving forward, quietly and legally, completely undetected, in a direction none of his suspicion had considered at all. By the time Grant realized his mistake with Farrow, he had lost nearly a year he could have spent looking in the right direction, and he carried a quiet embarrassment about that mistake that made him, for a period afterward, more cautious about raising any concerns to his father at all. The way Grant finally realized his mistake about Farrow is itself worth describing, because it illustrates how thoroughly he had convinced himself of a theory that simply was not true. He had followed Farrow, on 2 separate occasions, to locations Farrow shared with Alina for what Grant assumed were private meetings, only to discover, after finally working up the nerve to ask a mutual colleague directly, that both locations were venues for a literacy initiative the company had quietly funded for several years, a program Alina had taken a genuine personal interest in after learning that Harold's own father had struggled to read fluently throughout his working life. Grant later admitted that the discovery left him feeling foolish in a way that took months to fully shake off, not simply because he had been wrong, but because he had spent 8 months treating his stepmother with a cold, guarded suspicion she had never once addressed directly, likely because she had no idea it existed at all. This mistake mattered for more than Grant's own embarrassment. It meant that when Priya Chandrasekaran eventually brought him the real evidence, Grant approached it initially with far more caution than the situation actually warranted, assuming, based on his own recent history, that he was once again constructing a theory out of coincidence rather than genuine proof. It took Whitfield nearly 6 weeks of careful, methodical work before Grant allowed himself to fully believe that this time, unlike with Farrow, the pattern he was looking at was real. It was during this same broad period, roughly a decade into Harold and Alina's marriage, that Marjorie Doyle first began noticing details of her own, entirely separate from anything Grant had observed, and it would be years before the two of them ever compared notes. Marjorie had been with the Bennett family since before Carol's illness, long enough to have earned a level of trust in the household that came with a certain invisibility, the specific kind of invisibility that allows household staff to observe far more than anyone in the family typically accounts for. She noticed that Alina took certain phone calls exclusively in the garden, even in poor weather, always stepping outside rather than using any of the house's interior rooms, despite the property having several private studies where such calls could easily have been taken indoors. She noticed, over a period of roughly 2 years, that mail occasionally arrived at the house addressed to a post office box rather than the home address, mail that Alina collected quickly and without comment whenever it appeared. Marjorie said nothing about any of this for a very long time, in part because she genuinely liked Alina, who had always been kind to her personally, remembering her daughter's name and asking after her well-being in a way that felt, at least on the surface, sincere. This is another detail worth sitting with, because it complicates the story in a way that matters. Alina was not cold or dismissive toward the household staff. She was warm toward nearly everyone in Harold's orbit, which made the eventual discovery of her long-term financial planning feel, to everyone who eventually learned about it, even more difficult to reconcile with the person they had come to know over more than a decade. Marjorie began keeping a small private notebook, not out of any dramatic sense of suspicion, but out of an old habit Harold Bennett had encouraged in her years earlier, during a rare unguarded conversation near the end of Carol's illness, when Carol had told Marjorie that facts, carefully recorded, mattered more than feelings or accusations, because facts could not be argued with the way opinions could. Marjorie wrote down dates. She wrote down which calls happened in the garden and roughly how long they lasted. She did not draw conclusions from any of it, because she genuinely did not know, for years, whether what she was observing meant anything at all, or whether she was simply a woman who had grown so accustomed to watching a household closely that she had started seeing patterns where none actually existed. Meanwhile, Harold Bennett moved through his late 50s and into his 60s with a growing sense of contentment that, from the outside, looked exactly like a man who had successfully rebuilt his life after devastating loss. He began speaking, in private moments with Alina, about slowing down, about gradually handing more responsibility to Grant, about eventually purchasing a smaller, quieter property, somewhere his mornings would not begin with an early phone call from a regional manager. He believed, fully and without any reservation, that Alina was imagining that exact same future beside him, and every conversation they had about it seemed to confirm this. Alina asked thoughtful questions about where they might eventually live. She spoke, convincingly, about looking forward to traveling together once Harold's schedule finally opened up. There was no visible crack anywhere in the picture Harold saw of his own marriage. He had no way of knowing, during any of these conversations, that Alina had begun, roughly around this same time, a private and entirely separate process of her own, one that would eventually determine the actual outcome of everything Harold believed they were planning together. It was during the 11th year of the marriage that Alina first met, discreetly and without informing Harold, with an attorney named Rebecca Stern, who specialized almost exclusively in representing spouses of high net worth individuals during divorce proceedings. Rebecca's practice had built a quiet but formidable reputation for a particular kind of expertise, understanding exactly how prenuptial agreements could be tested, where their protections held firm, and where a careful, patient client might find opportunities the original document had never anticipated. Aliner's first meeting with Rebecca lasted nearly 3 hours, and by the end of it, Aliner had a clearer understanding than she had ever had before of exactly what her financial position would look like if she left the marriage immediately, compared to what it might look like if she waited for Harold to eventually restructure his estate around his own retirement. The math, Rebecca explained carefully, favored waiting, but only under specific conditions, only if certain assets remained in their current structure, and only if Aliner moved with patience rather than urgency. This is the moment, more than any other single moment in this entire story, that set the actual timeline in motion, not a single dramatic betrayal, but a calculated, professional assessment of financial timing, delivered across a desk in a quiet office, that would ultimately determine when a marriage that looked, from every outside vantage point, stable in content, would actually come to an end. Rebecca Stern's advice, according to notes that would only surface years later during the settlement discovery process, was built around 3 specific conditions she outlined to Aliner during that first meeting. First, that Aliner should avoid any large, easily traceable transfer of assets, and instead move smaller amounts gradually, staying beneath thresholds that would trigger automatic institutional review. Second, that Aliner should continue behaving, in every visible respect, exactly as a devoted and settled spouse would behave. Since any perceived change in the marriage's emotional tenor could prompt Harold's own advisors to review the estate more closely than they otherwise would. Third, and most significantly, that timing the filing to occur before any major restructuring of Harold's business holdings, such as a retirement transition, would meaningfully increase what Aliner could ultimately claim, since business restructurings often shifted personal assets into trusts and structures considerably harder to reach in a subsequent divorce proceeding. Aliner followed this guidance with a discipline that, once fully understood years later, struck even Nathaniel Cross as remarkable for its consistency. She did not deviate from the plan even during moments when the marriage felt, by her own private admission during the eventual settlement discussions, genuinely warm and easy. She attended Harold's 65th birthday celebration that same year, organized largely by her own hand, and gave a toast that brought several guests to tears, describing Harold as the great unexpected gift of her middle age. She meant this. She would later tell Rebecca Stern in a private conversation Whitfield's investigation eventually surfaced, and she also meant to file for divorce within the following 18 months, and she did not experience these two facts as being in any real conflict with each other, a detail that troubled Harold more than almost anything else he learned during the entire process. 3 years passed following that initial meeting, years during which Harold continued moving steadily toward the retirement conversation he had been having, in increasingly concrete terms, with his board and with Aliner herself. During this same 3-year period, Aliner met with Rebecca Stern 4 additional times, each meeting brief, each one focused on refining the same underlying question, whether the current moment represented the optimal point to file, or whether waiting slightly longer would yield a more favorable outcome once specific company transactions Harold was considering had been finalized. It was during the 4th year of this quiet parallel motion, roughly 18 months before Harold's eventual retirement announcement, that a young financial analyst named Priya Chandrasekaran, working at the accounting firm that had handled the Bennett family's financial affairs for over a decade, first noticed something that did not sit right during a routine account reconciliation. A series of transfers, modest individually, had been moving out of a joint account over the course of several months, and into an account that belonged to none of the parties Priya recognized from the family's standard filings. Each transfer sat just under the threshold that would have automatically triggered a compliance review, a detail that, once Priya noticed it, struck her as far too precise to be accidental. Priya sat with this discovery for nearly 3 weeks before deciding what to do with it, wrestling with a genuine professional dilemma, She had only been introduced to the Bennett family's financial affairs through a personal favor owed to Grant years earlier, from a period when Grant had helped Priya's brother secure an internship at Bennett Home and Textile, and she did not have a clear, official channel through which to raise a concern this sensitive. Raising it with Harold directly felt inappropriate, given that her formal relationship was with the accounting firm rather than with the family personally. Raising it with no one at all felt, increasingly, like a decision she would not be able to justify to herself later if the pattern continued and eventually caused real harm. She eventually brought what she had found to Grant, calling him directly rather than putting anything in writing, and describing, carefully and without speculation, exactly what the transfer pattern looked like on paper. Grant, listening to Priya describe transfers that lined up almost exactly with the timeline of his own long-standing unease, felt something settle into place that had been unsettled in him for years. The recognition that his instinct, however vague and however wrong it had been about Douglas Farrow years earlier, had actually been pointing at something real all along, just not in the direction he had originally assumed. It is worth taking a moment here to understand exactly what those years actually looked like inside the Bennett household, because from the outside, almost nothing about daily life there suggested anything was wrong. Harold and Alina hosted dinner parties for company executives and their spouses several times a year, evenings that longtime employees later remembered fondly, describing Alina as gracious, attentive, and genuinely skilled at making even the most junior guest feel welcome at the table. She learned the names of employees' children. She sent handwritten notes after company milestones. None of this warmth was, by any account gathered later, performed only for Harold's benefit. It extended to everyone in his orbit, which is precisely what made the eventual discovery so difficult for so many people to reconcile once the full truth finally came out. Alina also maintained, throughout this entire period, a genuinely close friendship with Harold's sister, a woman named Constance, who lived several states away and who spoke with Alina by phone almost every week. Constance later said, in one of the only conversations she ever had about the matter afterward, that she had never once suspected anything was wrong, that Alina had asked after Harold's health and happiness in every single call with what felt like real concern, and that learning the truth felt, to Constance, like losing a friendship as much as watching her brother lose a marriage. This detail matters because it illustrates something essential about how this kind of long, patient deception actually functions. It does not require constant vigilance or performance on every front. It simply requires enough genuine warmth in enough places that no single person ever has reason to look closely at the one thread that does not quite hold. Grant made a decision in that moment that would complicate everything that followed. Rather than bringing the information immediately to his father, he asked Priya to continue monitoring the account activity quietly, and he began, on his own time and without informing anyone else in the family, his own parallel investigation. He told himself this was the responsible approach, that bringing an incomplete and painful suspicion to his father too early could do more damage than good, especially given his own history of chasing the wrong lead with Farrow. In private moments, he was more honest with himself, admitting, much later, that he was also simply afraid of being wrong again, and even more afraid of being right and having to watch his father's face when the truth finally arrived. Over the following months, Grant hired a private investigator named Dale Whitfield, a former financial fraud examiner who had left law enforcement to work independently, specifically because Whitfield's reputation suggested someone who could trace complicated financial patterns without drawing attention to the inquiry itself. Whitfield's early work confirmed what Priya had already found and extended it considerably. The account receiving the transfers was linked, through a chain of ownership that took several weeks to fully untangle, to a small holding entity that had been established roughly 2 years earlier, an entity whose only listed officer was a paralegal working at a law firm Whitfield eventually identified as Stern and Associates, the same firm where Alina had been quietly meeting with Rebecca Stern for years. Whitfield's methodology, which he later described in general terms during the settlement discovery process, involved cross-referencing three entirely separate categories of public and legally obtainable records: corporate filings associated with the holding entity, property records tied to addresses the entity had used, and travel records that could be lawfully compared against the dates Alina had given Harold for her various trips. He began, deliberately, with the smallest and least conspicuous pieces, small business registrations that most people never think to check, precisely because he had learned, over years of similar work, that people who are careful about hiding large movements of money are rarely equally careful about the small administrative footprints those movements inevitably leave behind. It was through one of these small footprints, a registered agent fee paid from an account Alina still occasionally used for personal expenses, that Whitfield first connected the holding entity directly back to her. Whitfield also spent considerable time simply establishing patterns rather than chasing individual transactions, building out, week by week, a calendar that layered Alina's stated travel plans against the actual transfer dates, against phone records showing calls placed to Rebecca Stern's office, and against a handful of hotel reservations made under Alina's own name in the city where Stern and Associates was headquartered, reservations that did not correspond to any of the family visits Alina had described to Harold. No single layer of this calendar would have been damning on its own. Together, laid one over another, they formed a picture with almost no room left for innocent explanation, a level of convergence that Whitfield later said was rarer, in his experience, than people might expect, and that ultimately made his report to Grant considerably more useful in negotiations than it might otherwise have been. This is the point in the investigation where the story could easily tip into simple villainy, and I want to resist that temptation, because the full picture is more complicated and, in its way, more unsettling than a simple story of theft. The transfers Alina had been moving were not, strictly speaking, illegal. They were assets that existed within accounts she had at least partial legal access to under the terms of the marriage, being redirected, gradually and legally, into a structure that would make her eventual divorce settlement considerably more favorable, particularly if the transfers were completed before any court proceeding could examine the marital estate as it existed at a single, fixed point in time. Alina was not stealing from Harold in any criminal sense. She was positioning herself, patiently and with expert legal guidance, in a way that existed in a careful gray area the original prenuptial agreement had never fully anticipated. Grant and Whitfield spent nearly 5 months building a complete picture of the timeline, cross-referencing transfer dates against Alina's calendar, against phone records Whitfield was able to obtain through entirely legal means, against the dates of her periodic trips to visit what she described to Harold as an aging aunt in another state. Trips that, upon closer examination, aligned suspiciously well with additional meetings at Rebecca Stern's office rather than any actual family visit. By the time this 5-month investigation concluded, Grant possessed a document trail spanning nearly 3 years that told a clear and specific story, one his father had absolutely no idea existed. And still, Grant did not go to his father. This is, in many ways, the most difficult part of Grant's own role in this story to sit with, harder even than his earlier mistake with Pharaoh, because this time he had real evidence, and he still hesitated. He told himself repeatedly that he needed to find the right moment, a moment when his father would be least devastated by the news, though he understood on some level that no such moment actually existed. What he did not fully admit to himself until much later was that he had begun to hope, quietly and against all the evidence in front of him, that Alina might change course on her own, that the plan Whitfield had uncovered might simply stall out before it ever needed to be confronted directly. It was during this exact period of Grant's continued silence that Harold Bennett finally scheduled the announcement he had been building toward for the better part of 2 years, informing his board of directors that he intended to formally step down as chief executive within the next 18 months. The announcement came on an ordinary Thursday morning, delivered to a room full of executives and board members who had worked alongside Harold for decades, many of whom understood, better than almost anyone outside his immediate family, exactly what building this company had cost him over the course of his life. Harold allowed himself a rare display of visible emotion in that professional setting, thanking the company, thanking the board, and thanking, by name, his wife Eleanor, for supporting him through what he called the best years of his life. Eleanor sat in that room, smiling warmly, and let him hold her hand in front of everyone present. She had filed for divorce 6 weeks earlier. The papers were already signed and notarized. Rebecca Stern's office had already begun preparing the formal filing that would, once served, initiate a negotiation Harold did not yet know was already underway. Grant sat 3 seats down from his father during this entire announcement, a folder of evidence sitting untouched in a locked drawer of his own home office, watching his father's face as he spoke warmly about a woman Grant now knew, with near total certainty, had been planning an exit for years. I want you to sit with that image for a moment, because it captures something true about how these situations actually unfold in real families, far more often than the dramatic version most people imagine. There was no scene in that boardroom. There was no confrontation. There was simply a room full of people applauding a man's vision for his future, sitting beside a woman who had already, quietly and legally, ended it, and beside a son who possessed the proof of exactly that but had not yet found the courage to bring it forward. What none of them yet knew, not Harold at the head of that table, not Grant watching silently with a folder of evidence he could not bring himself to use, not Eleanor smiling and holding her husband's hand, was that Marjorie Doyle had, only 10 days earlier, been asked by Harold himself to retrieve a document from Eleanor's private study while Eleanor was traveling. Harold needed a property deed for a meeting he had scheduled with Nathaniel Cross about a quiet coastal property he had quietly been considering for their eventual retirement, and he recalled Eleanor once mentioning she kept important paperwork in a locked drawer of her desk. He handed Marjorie the small spare key from a dish by the door, a key Eleanor did not know existed, and asked her simply to look. Marjorie opened that drawer expecting to find a property deed. What she found instead would ultimately connect directly to everything Grant had already spent nearly a year quietly uncovering, though neither of them yet knew the other possessed any part of the same story. Marjorie stood in Eleanor's study for a long moment before she even opened the folder, because some part of her already understood, from nearly 2 decades of reading the quiet signals inside that house, that whatever sat inside that locked drawer was not going to be a simple property deed. When she finally lifted the folder out and opened it, she found a fully executed divorce filing, signed and notarized, dated 6 weeks before the retirement announcement Harold had already made in front of his entire board. Beside it sat a second folder, thinner but no less significant, containing financial records she did not fully understand in their technical detail, but understood completely in their broader shape. A pattern of transfers that matched, almost exactly, the small, quiet observations she had been recording in her own private notebook for nearly 2 years. She photographed every page carefully with her phone, replaced everything exactly as she had found it, and returned the spare key to the dish by the door well before Eleanor's return. She did not bring what she had found to Harold immediately. She sat with it for nearly a full week, turning the decision over in her mind every evening, aware that once she spoke, there would be no undoing what those words would do to a man she had watched build a life twice, once with Carol and once, he believed, with Eleanor. During that week, in a coincidence that neither of them could have planned, Marjorie happened to mention, in a brief and careful conversation with Grant about an unrelated household matter, that she had recently come across some financial paperwork of Eleanor that had concerned her. Grant, hearing this, understood immediately that Marjorie was describing something connected to what he and Whitfield had spent nearly a year documenting, and for the first time since this entire investigation began, he felt something shift from private suspicion into shared, undeniable reality. Grant and Marjorie met privately 2 days later, comparing, for the first time, everything each of them had separately gathered. Grant's financial trail spanning 3 years of transfers and Rebecca Stern's involvement, and Marjorie's own quiet record of phone calls, misdirected mail, and now the physical divorce filing itself sitting in a locked drawer upstairs. Together, the 2 accounts formed a complete and undeniable picture, one that neither of them could have assembled fully on their own, and one that made further delay feel, to both of them, genuinely dangerous rather than simply cautious. They agreed, that evening, that Harold needed to know everything, and that it needed to happen soon. It was Marjorie, ultimately, who brought it to Harold first, at Grant's request, since she was the one who had discovered the physical filing itself and could speak to exactly what she had seen with her own eyes. She asked Harold for a private moment, the first time in nearly 2 decades of service that she had ever initiated such a conversation herself, and she told him she needed him to look at something before he said a single word. And she told him honestly that she had waited longer than she should have out of fear, and that she was telling him this now because he deserved the truth more than he deserved her continued silence. Harold scrolled through the photographs on Marjorie's phone in near total silence, and I will not attempt to describe every detail of what crossed his face in that moment, because some moments do not need to be narrated in full to be understood. You already know this particular kind of devastation, if you have ever lived even a smaller version of it yourself. The specific and total collapse of realizing that someone has been rehearsing a shared future with you at the dinner table, while quietly filing away the paperwork for its ending in a locked drawer upstairs. What Harold did next told you everything about the kind of man he actually was beneath the decades of boardrooms and careful public composure. He did not raise his voice. He did not call Alina that night, and he did not immediately call Grant, though Marjorie gently told him that Grant already knew a great deal more than either of them had realized. He simply asked Marjorie to sit down across from him at the kitchen table, the same table where Alina had once asked him warm, curious questions about his business in the earliest days of their courtship, and he asked her to tell him everything, from the very beginning, and to take her time. The following morning, Harold called his son directly, and the conversation that followed was, by Grant's own later account, one of the most difficult of his life, not because his father was angry with him, but because Harold's first question was simply how long Grant had known, and Grant had to answer honestly that it had been nearly a year during which he had watched his father move steadily toward an announcement Grant already understood was built on an assumption that was no longer true. Harold listened to his son's full account without interrupting, the private investigator, the traced accounts, the connection to Rebecca Stern's firm, the 8 wasted months spent suspecting Douglas Farrow before the real pattern became clear. When Grant finished, Harold sat quietly for a long moment, and then told his son something that would matter a great deal to both of them in the months that followed, that he understood exactly why Grant had hesitated, because he might have done the same thing in his son's position, and that the important thing now was not assigning blame for the delay, but deciding together what to do with the truth they both now fully possessed. That conversation marked the beginning of a genuine repair between Harold and Grant, one that neither of them had expected to find on the other side of something this painful. Whatever old resentment had calcified between them since Harold's remarriage, resentment Grant had never fully named even to himself, began, quietly and without any dramatic reconciliation scene, to soften into something closer to real partnership. Over the following weeks, as they worked together with Nathaniel Cross to understand exactly what legal options existed, Harold found himself, for the first time in years, genuinely relying on his son's judgment rather than simply managing him as a subordinate executive within the company. Nathaniel Cross, reviewing the complete evidence Grant and Whitfield had assembled alongside Marjorie's photographs of the physical filing, identified something significant almost immediately: that the pattern of transfers Alina had directed toward the holding entity linked to Rebecca Stern's paralegal constituted a clear violation of the disclosure requirements built into the original prenuptial agreement. Requirements that obligated both parties to fully disclose any restructuring of jointly held or personally held assets above a certain threshold during the marriage. This single detail, buried in language neither Harold nor Alina had thought much about in over a decade, would ultimately determine far more of the settlement's outcome than either party initially expected. Alina returned home from what she had described to Harold as a visit to her sister, a trip that Whitfield's earlier phone record analysis had already revealed included a 2-hour meeting with Rebecca Stern rather than any actual family visit, and she found Harold waiting for her alone in the living room, a folder resting on the table in front of him. She understood immediately, from the particular stillness of the room, from the absence of any of Harold's usual warmth in his posture, that whatever was about to happen had already moved far beyond anything she could manage with her usual charm or careful reassurance. It would be easy to imagine this scene as an explosion, raised voices, and thrown accusations, the kind of confrontation that plays well in a trailer but rarely happens between two people who spent over a decade building a life together, however complicated that life eventually turned out to be. That is not what happened. Harold asked Alina to sit down. He told her calmly that he knew about the filing, and that he knew about the transfers, and that he knew about the 2-hour meeting with Rebecca Stern that had taken place instead of the family visit she had described to him. Then he asked her the only question that seemed to matter to him in that moment, whether any of what they had built together over the past decade had been real at all, or whether he had simply been the subject of a very long and very patient plan. Alina did not answer right away. When she finally spoke, her answer was neither a full confession nor a full denial, but it was, in its own way, one of the most honest things she had said to him in years. She told him that she had loved him, in the ordinary sense most people mean by that word, for a long time, genuinely, but that she had also learned, from an earlier and considerably more painful failed marriage, that love without financial security was not something she could afford to risk again, and that somewhere along the way, protecting herself had become, for her, inseparable from the marriage itself, even as the marriage continued to feel, on most ordinary days, entirely genuine. It is a complicated answer, and it should be sat with rather than simplified. Underneath its difficulty is something many people in long relationships quietly recognize in themselves, even if they never say it aloud, the private calculation that exists beneath even genuine affection, the question of what a person is actually willing to risk, and what they have already decided, somewhere deep down, they are not. Harold asked her a second question, one he later said mattered to him even more than the first, whether she had ever considered simply telling him the truth directly, whether she had ever imagined a version of this conversation happening years earlier. Honestly, before any transfers, before any locked drawer, before any of it needed to be uncovered rather than shared. Alina's answer to this second question was quieter than her first, and by Harold's account, considerably more difficult for her to give. She admitted that she had imagined that conversation many times, in the early years especially, and that she had ultimately decided against it, not because she doubted Harold's decency, but because she did not trust that any honest conversation about financial security, however carefully framed, would not fundamentally change the way he saw her, would not turn her, in his eyes, from a wife into a calculation. She said she had preferred, in the end, to let him believe in something uncomplicated for as long as she could sustain it, even knowing what that choice would eventually cost them both. Harold did not shout, and he did not ask her to leave the house that night. He simply told her the marriage was effectively over, a fact she had already decided nearly a year and a half before he ever said the word retirement out loud, and that the details of the separation would now be handled entirely through their respective attorneys who understood, thanks to Grant, Priya, Whitfield, and Marjorie's combined work, exactly what had actually happened during the final years of the marriage. The settlement negotiations that followed stretched across nearly 11 months, considerably longer and more complicated than either party had initially anticipated. Precisely because Nathaniel Cross's identification of the disclosure violation gave Harold's side significant leverage that Rebecca Stern had not fully accounted for, and she first advised Alina on her timeline years earlier. Rebecca argued, across several rounds of negotiation, that the transfers represented legitimate financial planning rather than concealment, while Nathaniel countered, using the detailed timeline Whitfield had assembled, that the pattern of transfers, combined with Alina's demonstrably false explanations for her travel during the same period, made the concealment argument very difficult to sustain in front of a judge who would eventually need to review the full record. The negotiations themselves unfolded across a series of long, careful sessions that Nathaniel Cross later described as some of the most technically demanding of his career, precisely because so little of the underlying conduct was straightforwardly illegal. Each session focused on a narrower and narrower question: whether a specific transfer had been properly disclosed under the terms of the original agreement, whether a particular trip-a-leaner had described one way to Harold and another way to her own calendar constituted evidence of concealment, or simply a private matter she was entitled to keep to herself, whether the cumulative pattern, taken as a whole, demonstrated intent in a way that any single transfer could not on its own. Rebecca Stern fought hard on each of these points, and there were several sessions where Nathaniel Cross privately admitted to Harold that the outcome could genuinely go either way, depending on how a judge might eventually weigh the evidence if the matter proceeded to trial. What ultimately shifted the balance decisively in Harold's favor was Whitfield's discovery, late in the process, of a single email a leaner had sent to Rebecca Stern nearly 2 years earlier. An email that had been inadvertently preserved on a shared law firm server despite a leaner's assumption that all such communications were fully protected. In it, a leaner asked directly whether waiting until after Harold's retirement announcement would materially affect her position, language that Nathaniel argued, and Rebecca ultimately could not fully rebut, demonstrated clear awareness that the timing of the filing was being deliberately managed relative to Harold's own business decisions, undermining any claim that the transfers represented ordinary, good-faith financial planning, unconnected to the marriage's actual trajectory. Ultimately, both sides agreed to a settlement that avoided a public trial, a decision Harold pushed for specifically because he did not want the details of the marriage's final years or the mechanics of a leaner's financial planning to become a matter of public record that could embarrass either his company or his son. The final settlement gave a leaner considerably less than what Rebecca Stern's original calculations, years earlier, had projected she would eventually receive, though it was still, by any ordinary measure, a substantial sum. Leaner left the marriage with less than she had spent years carefully planning to secure, and with, according to people who spoke with her afterward, no visible regret about the timeline of her decisions, only, it seemed, a quiet frustration at having been caught before the plan had fully run its course. There is one additional detail that emerged during the settlement negotiations that deserves mention here, because it complicates the picture of a leaner in a way the story would be incomplete without. During discovery, Nathaniel Cross's team uncovered evidence suggesting that a leaner's first marriage, the one that had ended years before she ever met Harold, had followed a strikingly similar pattern in its final years: gradual asset repositioning ahead of a filing that had, in that earlier case, been discovered too late for her first husband to meaningfully respond to it. This was not a single isolated decision a leaner had made under unique pressure. It was, apparently, a pattern she had developed and refined over the course of 2 marriages, a detail that reframed, for Harold and for Grant both, much of what they had assumed about how deliberate her planning with them had actually been from the very beginning. Harold retired 11 months later than he had originally planned, once the settlement was finalized, and the version of retirement he finally stepped into looked nothing like the picture he had rehearsed in boardrooms and quiet dinner conversations with a leaner over the preceding years. It looked steadier, built on relationships that had been tested, and had survived rather than relationships that had simply never been examined closely enough to reveal their actual foundations. Grant did not take over the company through the dramatic handoff Harold had once imagined announcing to his board, but something more valuable happened between father and son in the months following the divorce, a genuine rebuilding of trust that included, eventually, an honest conversation about Grant's earlier mistake with Douglas Farrow, a conversation that helped both of them understand how easily suspicion can attach itself to the wrong target when the real threat is patient enough to stay hidden. Harold began including Grant in decisions he had previously kept close to his own chest for decades, not simply as a formality ahead of an eventual handoff, but because he had come to genuinely trust his son's judgment in a way their relationship had never fully allowed before. Grant, for his part, stopped watching his father's life from a careful, guarded distance and started simply being present in it, the way a son might if nearly 2 years of secret investigation had never needed to happen in the first place. Harold eventually asked Grant to step into the chief executive role formally, not out of guilt or obligation, but because he had watched his son handle the hardest period of the family's life, with a steadiness and discretion that told him everything he needed to know about whether the company would be safe in his hands. Priya Chandrasekharan's role in the story remained, for the most part, quietly behind the scenes, though Harold, once he learned the full extent of what she had risked in bringing her initial discovery to Grant rather than simply staying silent, insisted on personally thanking her and ensuring her firm recognized her work appropriately. Priya later said, in one of the only interviews she ever gave about the matter, that she had spent weeks agonizing over whether raising the concern at all was overstepping her role, and that she had ultimately decided that staying silent, simply because speaking up felt uncomfortable, was not a standard she wanted to hold herself to professionally. Dale Whitfield closed out his involvement with a final report that Nathaniel Cross's team used extensively throughout the settlement negotiations, and he later described the case, without naming any of the parties involved, as one of the clearest examples he had encountered in his career of how financial deception does not require anything illegal to be genuinely devastating, that patience and legal precision could accomplish nearly the same result as outright fraud, simply on a longer timeline and with considerably more plausible deniability along the way. Marjorie Doyle remained in the Bennett household long after the divorce was finalized. Several months after the settlement concluded, Harold asked her to sit with him one quiet evening, something he had never done in nearly 2 decades of her working in his home, and he told her plainly that her years of careful, quiet observation had likely saved him from losing far more than money, that without her willingness to finally speak, he might have gone through his entire retirement without ever understanding what had actually happened in his own marriage. He asked her, gently, why she had waited so long to bring it to him. Marjorie told him she could have spoken sooner, but that he needed to be ready to trust the truth once it finally arrived, not simply to believe it out of fear because she had told him to, and that she had waited until she could show him something solid rather than force him to accept something before he was genuinely ready to see it clearly for himself. Harold nodded slowly at this, understanding, in a way he might not have understood even a year earlier, that some truths only truly land when a person is finally prepared to receive them, and that the people who care about you most are sometimes the ones patient enough to wait for that moment rather than force it upon you before you are able to bear it. He bought the quiet coastal property he had once imagined sharing with a leaner, and for the first several months after moving in, he went there largely alone, learning slowly what it felt like to sit with a life that had not turned out the way he had rehearsed it for so many years. Over time, Grant began joining him there on weekends, and the two of them built something out of the wreckage of the previous years that neither had expected, a relationship grounded in actual honesty, rather than the careful, guarded distance that had defined most of their years together before any of this began. Harold also, in the years following the divorce, made a quiet but deliberate change to how he approached the company's own governance, one that Nathaniel Cross later said reflected everything Harold had learned from the experience. He established a small, independent internal review process for any transaction above a certain threshold involving family trusts or personal holdings, a safeguard he readily admitted should have existed years earlier, not out of any particular distrust of the people around him, but simply as a matter of sound practice that a devastating personal experience had finally taught him to value. He often told Grant, in the years that followed, that the lesson of the entire experience was not that people could not be trusted, but that trust and verification were never actually in conflict with each other, and that the failure to build in verification was what had allowed the deception to continue as long as it did. Constance, Harold's sister, remained close with her brother throughout this period, though her friendship with Alina ended entirely once the truth came out, a loss Constance described, years later, as smaller than Harold's but still genuinely difficult, since it meant reevaluating years of conversations she had believed were built on real closeness. She eventually told Harold that the hardest part of the entire experience for her was not anger at a leaner, but the quiet, unsettling recognition that a person could sustain that much warmth toward people who meant nothing to her long-term plans, simply because warmth was useful to maintaining the appearance she needed to maintain. Douglas Farrow, the executive Grant had wrongly suspected years earlier, eventually learned, informally and much later, that he had briefly been the subject of a private investigation he knew nothing about, a detail that Grant, to his credit, addressed directly and apologized for once the full story came out within the company. Farrow, by all accounts, took the apology graciously, and the literacy initiative he and a leaner had worked on together continued under new leadership within the company, entirely unaffected by anything that had happened in the family that had originally funded it. What stays with me most about Harold Bennett's story is not that he eventually lost a portion of his fortune, because in the end, thanks to the people around him who refused to stay silent, he lost considerably less than a leaner had once calculated he would. What stays with me is the quieter loss underneath all of it, the one far harder to measure in any settlement agreement, the simple and painful assumption that the person closest to you is building the exact same future you believe you are building together. Eleanor was never planning a marriage in the way Harold understood the word. She was planning, patiently and across many years, an exit, and she was skilled enough and patient enough to let him believe otherwise for far longer than most people could ever sustain a deception of that size. But this story does not end with Eleanor's patience, however remarkable it was in its own troubling way. It ends with someone else's patience entirely, a housekeeper who waited nearly 2 decades to be fully trusted with the truth of a household, and who then waited a little longer still, until she could bring what she knew to the man she served not as an accusation delivered in anger, but as something solid he could finally see clearly for himself, in his own time, in his own kitchen, at his own pace. It ends, too, with a son who made real mistakes along the way, who chased the wrong suspicion for the better part of a year, who hesitated even after he had genuine proof in hand, and who ultimately chose, when it mattered most, to bring the truth forward rather than continue protecting himself from the discomfort of delivering it. So I will leave you with the same question this story keeps circling back to, again and again, no matter how many times I sit with it myself. How many people around you might already be planning an ending you have not been told about yet? And if the truth arrived tomorrow quietly, in a folder on your own kitchen table, would you have someone in your life patient enough and brave enough to be the one who finally shows you? If this story stayed with you, there is another one waiting, a family, a hidden ledger, and a courtroom that changed everything for a woman whose name you have not heard yet. If you want to go further into stories like this one, stay close, and we will see you in the next one.